Thank you for joining us today. As the search committee stated in the informational letter you received earlier this week, knowledge is power, and you are taking the time to find out more about an important step our church is considering. This morning, we are privileged to have Randy Hyvonen join us on Zoom and in our sanctuary. Randy brings a wealth of knowledge on shared ministry, both as a pastoral minister who has himself served in 2 churches, and as an area minister who has helped to set up many shared ministries. Before I turn the screen over to Randy, I would like to share with you the agenda for this morning. Randy will open with prayer. Then he will talk about his experiences, including bridge ministries in both Westfield and Southwick. After that, we will open the floor to discussion. If you are on Zoom, you need only to raise your hand and unmute your screen. With the help of Rachel, Martha, and Cindy, I will do my best to recognize all of you. If you are in the sanctuary, we have provided paper and pencil for you to write your questions or comments. Steve Pierce will be scanning the sanctuary, and you will be able to hand these to him. Can everyone still hear me? At the end of the meeting, Randy will again lead us in prayer. So now, on with our presentation. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to see so many faces I know from my time with you before, and I look forward to sharing this special time together with you today. As I was thinking about prayer, I thought a couple things have come up for me that I wanted to just name before inviting you into prayer. As you all know, today is All Saints' Day, and I happened to dip into your pre-recorded worship and saw that you were remembering 19 different people, some of whom I knew. And I looked at the church where I'm a member here in South Hadley, and today we lifted up 16 members and friends who have passed on All Saints' Day. The second thing is we're all mindful of how we're reaching new highs in COVID cases. And this weekend I've learned sad news that a favored niece of ours and a cousin of hers, who's like a niece to us, have both tested positive now. And so we have many of us, I'm sure, who have had personal contact with this dreaded disease. And we all sit in nervousness about an election in a couple of days. It's actually been ongoing and it will go on for a while. So those are all kind of mixed thoughts. But I also lift up the fact that last night was the first time a Halloween full moon has appeared for all time zones in the United States since 1944. And if you think about the anxiety people must have been living with in 1944, a lot of parallels with the issues we face today. It's good to take it as a good omen that bad times pass and hope is ahead. So with that in mind, I invite you now into prayer, a prayer that I shared when I did this same kind of sharing of time with the Southwick members a few months ago. Let us pray. Dear God, as we pause for prayer, we do so giving thanks for our ability to gather virtually and safely, mindful that so many fellow citizens of our nation have been forced from their homes due to hurricanes, wildfires, and coronavirus conditions. We give thanks for all the blessings we have received and pray for your guidance as we seek new ways to respond to the needs of others here in our own communities, across the nation, and throughout the world. We also pray for your guidance as the members of Westfield Church discern how to best move forward in their life as a faith community. We pray that you would lead us so that we may delight in your will and follow in your ways to the glory of your name. Amen. Well, as Janet said already, I've had a lot of experience over the years working with shared ministries. My own home church, even after I had moved away, entered a shared ministry for a while with a Methodist church 12 miles down the road. But for me, the reality is that in 18 years of conference ministry following that opening ministry experience I had as a local church pastor, I've not only lived it as a pastor, but worked with, I counted 27 different shared ministries over the 18 years I did conference work. A couple things I lift up from that to, as a person trying to suggest the possibility of shared ministry, I always took into consideration things like geography. Does it make sense? Are they close enough that it will be workable? There's always an issue of the timing, that two churches that might share ministry be at the same point of need personally, that they need someone to guide them. They're seeking a new pastor, whether it be part-time or full-time as a shared pastor. There are issues about the pool of ministers available to ministry. And the reality is that pool is pretty small for part-time ministers. Either it's old retired guys like me who end up being those part-time ministers in settings, or it sometimes can be someone who has a partner who is full-time in other vocation with adequate salary and benefits, so that the part-time minister can make it work in a shared life with family. The other reality is that shared ministries can be between two UCC congregations, as we're considering here, or it can be with many other denominations with which the UCC has different kinds of ties. So I've experienced shared ministries with disciple churches, Presbyterian churches, Methodist churches, Lutheran churches, and even Mennonite churches. One of the things that I'll say up front, just to reinforce information you already received from Janet, is that in a shared ministry, as you share ministry with another congregation, if you were to choose to do so, you maintain your own identity. Westfield Church will still be Westfield Church with your building, the use of your building as it has been used in the past. You have your own budget, your own leadership controls your budget. You are just pooling resources with another congregation in shared ministry to hire a single full-time minister, or even to hire a team of husband and wife, for example, which I will share later as an example. You maintain your own mission as well, and the various kinds of ministry that have marked your life over the years. So those are some of the givens, but I hope as I share some examples, you'll see the opportunity for new things coming into your life if you share ministry with another congregation. So I want to start by sharing my personal experience in 1973, coming out of seminary in Nashville, Tennessee. I was invited by a conference staff person in Ohio to consider Ohio for ministry. I had been wanting to return to the West. As you all know, I'm a Montanan through and through, and I wanted to get back home again after many years of being away. But I thought, why not look into it? And so I said, okay. And he set me up with 3 different interviews in one weekend in March of 1973. And I drove up to Ohio wondering, what's this going to be like? I'd never done an interview for a call to ministry before. And it turned out I was set up with 4 different interviews that weekend. The first one with a single church with solid ministry. and I met their search committee. And then I moved on to a shared ministry, a church in a town of 5,000 and a country church 17 miles away. And then the third, that one I had an interview with each of those churches because they hadn't formed a single committee to do the interview. And then at the end of that time, that weekend, which was a very full weekend, I interviewed at another shared ministry that had been shared for years, and they had a single search committee that interviewed me. I won't go into the details of the interviews. I did last time with Southwick, but I don't want to ramble on too long about it. I just want to say I chose the middle one, the town church and the country church. And I made that decision because it was a unique opportunity I hadn't really thought about before. And I liked the feeling of both groups, even though they were as different as oil and water. An English heritage congregational church in a town and a German evangelical historic church out in the country. And since I hadn't had any real offers out west, I said yes to this call and began soon after I graduated. And what I would share with you about that ministry, the distance was a bit of a challenge, having to have worship at 9:30 to 10:30 in the country church was what we set up. And then I had 30 minutes to drive 17 miles and be in the pulpit in town. But I made it every Sunday, so it was doable. 5 miles between Westfield and Southwick is a piece of cake by comparison. The reality that unfolded for us and was something that I felt could be the case was that we were able to maintain the distinct ministries of each church, but we added a number of new things that really brought new life. Both of those churches had dwindled, were almost dormant, had not had full-time ministry in a long time. And was the predecessor for me in both places were men in their late 70s or early 80s even, and basically they were just preaching and handling hospital calls. So in the time I was with them, we created a joint youth group that became a very dynamic group. We had a men's basketball team between the two churches. The youth group girls made uniforms and were cheerleaders. We were the only team in the church league with our own cheerleaders. The women's group got together from time to time to do special things. We did a joint Easter service each year. We did some mission together that hadn't happened before. Those were all new things that evolved in shared ministry that were add-ons to what had been before. And I can tell you now, I've looked up the history of those two churches these many years since 1973 when I started with them. Those churches are no longer paired together, but both of them are still alive and are able to be a force in their communities. Well, I went on from that into my conference work starting in 1993. And over the next 18 years, I worked with over 300 churches. And I counted up, I believe I had 27 shared ministries among those churches that I worked with. When I say worked with, basically all the churches I worked with, I helped them with search and call. So I was a part of their discernment always, how to go forward into the future with new leadership. I want to give you an example of several of the different kinds of shared ministry that I worked with, to give you a sense of possibilities. So one was in Southwest Ohio, Northern Kentucky, where I had a couple, husband and wife, both ordained, who I got to know while working together with them at General Synod Cleveland in 1996, I think it was. I got to know them. And when I saw that they were searching for a church and would like to serve a church together, I approached two churches in Cincinnati that were both only able to have part-time ministry. And I said, how about you two working together and consider this couple that I've come across? The long story short, they decided to call Gail and Stuart, and Gail and Stuart brought new life to those two churches, new mission. They worked out a unique deal where they never identified ahead of time who was going to preach. One would preach in one church on Sunday and the other one preached in the other church. And that way no cliques were formed. Everyone always knew that they were going to have either Gail or Stuart for their Sunday worship. And Gail and Stuart together did all the hospital calling and the confirmation work, the group work, and so on. And they created new mission in both churches. It was a very healthy kind of relationship. That's a very positive story. Then I had a negative experience. Two churches that had long been in shared ministry, and they made the mistake of calling a minister before they had guidance from the conference. They called a guy who was, his name was Sam, and he was from the Church of Christ, very evangelical, conservative background. And so I had landed in Cincinnati, new on staff, and my colleague and I took Sam out for lunch and asked him if he was going to be a faithful member of the United Church of Christ now that he was serving two of our congregations. He assured us he would be. And, you know, within a week, we got his newsletter. He was slamming the UCC for all of its positions. And over time, he brought in a number of new members to the one church, people who he had worked with in the past. And they became the majority, and they voted for that church to break the partnership and to leave the United Church of Christ. That left the smaller church with 20 members wondering, what do we do now? We're not in a position at all to have a full-time minister. Not even, how would we even find a part-time minister with 20 of us? So I met with them and I said, I have an idea for you. I know a seminarian whose husband is a full-time minister, and maybe she could be your student pastor for a few years while she's finishing seminary and you seek what your future would be. One of the women, the 20 were all there, and one of them said, oh, that won't work for us. And I said, why not? And she said, because we just had a woman interim a while back and that didn't work out. And I said to her, well, you know, you just had a man, Sam, and that didn't work out. And I don't know what else to do for you because I just deal with men and women. She said, oh, I get your point. Okay, we'll try it. And I said, well, I haven't even talked to this student pastor yet, but I'll see if she's willing. And I said, let's try it for 3 weeks. They both ended up agreeing, that small church and that pastor. She stayed on, and then we ordained her in that church, and she had many years of ministry with them while her husband was working full-time in Cincinnati in a church. When he received a new call, she then moved with the family. And I'm not sure what that small church did next, but I've looked and they still exist. So that was an experience in the Cincinnati area. I worked with many churches in Washington, North Idaho, and Alaska that also had shared ministry examples. But I'm going to go next to a very unique one that I worked with in Montana. Montana was a challenge because of the fact that it is a large geography. The northwest corner church reaching down to one in northern Wyoming and Buffalo. The distance is that of Chicago to New York City. And there's no plane service in Montana and northern Wyoming, so I had to drive everywhere I went. But even so, we found ways to to create shared ministries. And the most interesting one and most enjoyable for me in many ways was one that I inherited. It had existed for years already. 2 UCC churches in northeastern Montana sharing ministry with a Methodist church. So it kind of you see, if you know Methodism, they used to have what they called point charges, and sometimes the old Methodist ministers would ride a horse and deal with 3 or 4 different churches in a month, maybe only once a month in each church. But with cars, it's more possible to share in that way. And I experienced Tim, the pastor who had been there for years, serving the 2 UCC churches and the Methodist church. He and his wife and family lived in one town where they bought an old hardware store, turned it into a thrift store. It was connected to a liquor store, which they also bought and owned. So Tim not only owned a thrift store and a liquor store, and then he was elected mayor of the small town where they lived, and he pastored 3 different churches. He knew those people really well because anyone who came into the liquor store to buy liquor, he knew their habits, and he sold goods to them in the thrift store, and he educated their kids and worked the confirmation. And he remained very vibrant, and they've remained vibrant. Near the end of my time there, I retired in 2011, and just, I think in 2009, Tim came up with a new idea to do confirmation with kids from those churches. They did a river float on the Missouri River as a part of their confirmation education. It was really novel and the kind of thing that could happen when you do shared ministry in that way. So I now turn to your experience, my experience with you, with Southwick and with Westfield. As you know, I served you briefly and for some months, and it was a member of your church who suggested to the organist at Southwick that they call me when they had a sudden need for a part-time interim minister. And I ended up doing for Southwick about the same thing I did for you. And in the process, I can say I had a pretty good sense of who you both are as faith communities. And it occurred to me near the end of my time with Southwick that both of you were on the path of probably not, Southwick I knew was not able anymore to have a full-time minister. And I suspected that would be the reality ahead for you, which now you are saying. And so I probably was one of the ones who planted the seed for you're considering maybe sharing ministry, the 2 communities. I mentioned it to Jill Graham on the conference staff because I didn't want to get out of line myself taking over conference ministry. But Jill thought it was a great idea, and I know she's moved forward with both of your leadership groups in this discussion. And she's the one who suggested that you even turn to me for some conversation like we're having here today. So with her blessings, I'm glad to share this kind of thinking with you. And a couple things that occurred to me, like I've implied already, you're close enough together that it would make it very easy for a pastor or a pastoral team, if you had a husband and wife like Gail and Stuart, to live in that area and get to both churches easily. That pastor would be serving the same basic hospital network, which makes it easier. And halfway between the 2 of you is the retirement community where members from both churches reside, the American Inn. I got to know that place from my time with you and also with Southwick. And the retirement communities in the area house members from both congregations. So it would seem very natural for a minister to be serving both congregations and reaching out to the pastoral needs of both. And then as I think about who you are as entities, I could envision exciting joint youth ministry and mission projects that could unfold. And you may not know, but as you know, you have a wonderful music ministry, and Southwick has a fine music ministry too, and a unique additional piece. They have a bell choir that's really fun to listen to. So there's a lot of little things that could be add-ons to your life together if you were to share ministry together. Finally, as some of your leadership knows, there's been conversation with the church in Ludlow and Wilbraham, which have moved together into a shared ministry. And the Ludlow church had been searching for a part-time minister for 3 years and getting nowhere because the pool is just simply too small. That led them then, through Jill's leadership, to the suggestion of working shared together with Wilbraham. I ended up having actually preached in both of those churches during their interim period where they had a shared interim minister. And they were already then, during that time, beginning to talk about maybe having a shared ministry. And as many of you know, they have moved on to that. My sense is that it's going very well. I have a friend who lives here at Loomis Village, who's one of the lay leaders of the Ludlow Church, and she's thrilled with how it's unfolded. So it seemed to me to have been a good move. And my final comment to you would be then that I think it could be a good move for Westfield and Southwick if you both were to decide to share your ministry in the future. So Janet, that's kind of my rambling summary of some of my past involvements.
Well, thank you, Randy. This is great information, and I think it's very good for our congregation to kind of get a flavor, a feel of what it might be like if we share a pastor. And so right now, what I'll do is I'll open up the floor to any questions you might have. If you're in the congregation, you can simply write it down and it will get to Cindy and she'll message us so we can ask the question. If you do write it down, I'd appreciate it if you'd also sign your name so I can attribute it to who is asking the question. So if you have any questions, simply raise your hand and I will call on you. Well, my gosh, a deafening silence.
I do notice that a lot of the people on the Zoom page don't have their image showing, so they may have questions and you can't see their hand raising. But if they unmuted themselves, they could speak up for you even, and you could know.
Randy, how much problem did you have with deciding which church got which time for the pastor?
That was always worked out by the joint committee that the two churches form to make plans together. And usually it ended up being pretty much the same time, but sometimes if you have a church that has a much larger budget and larger membership, you maybe put a different amount into the pool and you say, basically, we're going 2/3, 1/3. But one of the realities with the shared ministry is that, and a big difference I would add between a pastor being shared or a part-time minister who has a full-time job that is the basic means of support for that person and his or her family. If you have a part-time minister who has to work full-time elsewhere, that person's not going to be as available for emergencies and hospital calls, and would even have trouble scheduling weddings, for example, or well, you can always do weddings on a weekend or something, but funerals come up suddenly and are hard to schedule sometimes. But a shared minister is going to be able to always be available. That's the nature of ministry. It's 24/7 on call. And so a shared minister will deal with the needs that arise in the two churches as they arise. And so some of it is self-governing. That shared minister may end up saying, I worked a lot this week on Westfield's issues, and I kind of slided Southwick. So next week I've got to pick up a few more things at Southwick. So it's self-governing in that way. But in terms of upfront management, the two churches work out how much they're going to put into the pool that pays for the salary and benefits, and discusses how you're going to work out time. Does that answer your question, Carol?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Shirley, you have your hand up. Can you unmute yourself?
There you are.
I'm a noisy person on Zoom. My machine is noisy. My question is, how have both congregations responded to this idea, assuming that the word is out, so to speak, even if it's just informal conversations, and the subject being brought up? Do you have a sense of how people are feeling about it in both churches?
That might be one that I can answer. And please jump in, any other search committee members or church committee members. What happened first, I'll talk about Southwick. The search committee in Southwick was initially opposed to it because they had they'd completed their profile and they were afraid they'd have to toss it out. And so they were reassured that we would both be using our profiles. In a sense, it's a different view on what we're both looking for. And after a lot more communication was passed on, including a meeting with Randy that we've alluded to, they took a congregational vote as to whether or not they wanted to move forward. And their vote was 61 in favor and 10 opposed. So it was overwhelming support from Southwick. And they are anxious to move forward with us. And I have that on the word of the moderator there. As far as our congregation goes, I haven't heard anything negative from the Westfield congregation. But now I guess I would open the floor to other people in that case. Any other people have a sense of how Westfield is feeling? Okay, I will go on. Oh yes, Rita, would you unmute yourself, please? Rita, can you unmute yours? Good.
I don't know that it's been out there enough for people to have really discussed it enough. So maybe now with this meeting, there might be more forthcoming.
I think that's great to know. And there are several more steps before our congregation decides if we want if we want to commit ourselves. Indeed, the entire congregation will vote on that at a congregational meeting. And we saw this meeting with Randy as an informational meeting. So Rita, I think you're right on the money with this one. Carol, can you unmute yourself?
Cindy has sent you 2 messages you might want to check.
Exactly. And let me go to these messages and then we can come back to other comments. And this is a message from Sandy White. do we have a better chance of hiring a part-time, 3/4 or half-time minister, a full-time minister, or a shared minister, given the same benefit package? And I guess I would defer to Randy with his thoughts about that.
Yeah, the reality is very simple economics. If you say you had in mind a full-time minister with the package being $90,000, that's maybe close to what you've had in the past, I'm not sure. And then you're feeling you can't come up with that much anymore. Say you come up with, I'll split it, that you come up with 45,000 and Southwick comes up with 45,000, you still then have a full package for a full-time minister. And anything less than that brings you into a different pool of applicants, which is a much smaller pool. One of the realities I didn't mention, I mentioned it to Southwick and I'll share it with you. I worked with a church in Eastern Washington. It was a small church, really struggling to make it work out full time anymore. They were not getting any applicants because their package was really on the low side. And I knew they couldn't stretch more. And there were reasons why I didn't bring up them doing shared ministry with a nearby UCC church, because there were some bad things that had happened in their shared history. And I was told when I came on staff, don't mention merger or sharing between those two churches. So I was left with the task of how to help this church find a minister. I ended up writing a personal letter describing the church and asking pastors if I could put their profile. These were pastors I knew were out in the national search process. I sent that letter to 100 ministers. Only 2 even answered my letter. One was a woman, second career. She'd been in the banking industry before, just coming out of seminary. And the other was a disciple of Christ minister who had the privilege of call in the UCC as well. So I presented those 2 profiles to the church. They chose to call the woman. And then we got down to my working with their leadership about the package they were going to finally offer this woman. The treasurer wanted to cut the amount. And I had to say to her, you realize this woman has expended all of her savings to get through seminary, and she still has so much educational debt. She has a monthly bill that, together with what she will have to pay to run a car and buy food, is more than she can handle. If you cut, like you're suggesting, she can't come be your pastor. She can't afford to, and you're back to zero again. And so they did stretch themselves to make that offer, and they called her. So that's the reality of, as you talk about calling someone, if you're at the point now where you can't afford a full-time package that will draw someone from that larger pool in the UCC, and you're offering 3/4 or part-time, you're only going to find someone who has other resources in his life, her life, family life to be able to afford doing that kind of ministry with you. Or you come up with someone who's retired but still wants to do ministry. So that's the kind of breakdown that happens, the realities that you face in doing this.
I have another question, and that is the sharing of children's faith activities, adolescent faith activities, could be very enriching. Are there any other advantages interpersonally? And this comes from Carol G.
Yeah, the experience I had with the country church and the town church was such that the first few times I brought these kids together, it was like mixing oil and water. Very different life experiences, different values. And it was hard to even get them to talk to each other. And then we did a joint mission project together. We went down to Xenia, Ohio and helped clean up properties after a tornado had come through and destroyed things. And in those 48 hours of working together, these young people bonded in unexpected ways. And we went on from there to do all kinds of exciting shared ministries over the years. We had a dynamic youth group. I gave a lot of time to youth ministry in those days, and in my later, when I became the pastor in Ohio, and for 10 years I was pastor of a large, not a large church. It was an urban church that drew from a large geography. And at the height of our youth group there, we had 20 kids in our youth group from, I think, 12 different school districts, 50-50 black and white. And so my experience with youth ministry in different bodies is that it's very enriching to experience people who have different life experiences. And if you find ways to work together, you overcome those differences, you find your commonalities, you join in sharing your excitement about ministry. And the ministry that unfolds then with youth sharing in that way flows over into the life of the larger church. So as I think about Southwick and Westfield, I could imagine some interesting things happening between the two churches' youth that would then be enlivening for adults in both churches. And the adults get drawn into what gets shaped up by the youth ministry. That church I was serving, one of the highlights we had that was just internal in our own church with kids from all different school districts. We did a musical, so this moved from the youth group to all ages. We had 20 kids doing a musical based on the creation, the biblical story of creation. It was written by a Jewish composer. And we did this musical. It was 90 minutes long. The kids were all the stars. Our two daughters were two of the solo singers in it, and there was dancing, and members of the church made props. Members of the church made lunch for every weekend when we had rehearsals. And we even took that musical from Cleveland down to Fort Worth, Texas, to General Synod, and we performed the musical to members attending the national meeting of the church. You can imagine how stimulating that was for the life of that church I was pastor in for months. The biblical story prevailed in our joint life.
Yes, Rita.
I'm unmuted here. I have perhaps an indelicate question to ask.
Oh, good.
Oh, good. When we talk about a full package, having a full-time minister, in dollars and cents, what are we talking money-wise?
That I would have to defer to the budget committee. And as you know, we're right at the end of stewardship. So they would really be the people to answer that. And I know.
Randy, tell us from UCC what does UCC recommend for a full-time minister?
I'm not current with this, so I'm going to be very approximate, but what I can share with you is that, you know, the last time I worked with a search committee, putting together the package and dealing with the, what was the recommended within that conference, and that varies from conference to conference. But a full-time minister, I'm going to say roughly is $100,000. And you have to recognize that probably 20,000 of that is the medical cost package. Medical costs are so high these days for a family, and that's a normal part of an attractive full package. And the other thing to bear in mind is that all seminarians come out of seminary these days with far more seminarian and college debt than was the case when I came out in 1973. But even then, when salaries were much lower, I turned down some options because I just couldn't afford with a young family to say yes to what was being offered. So you have to deal with that in mind too. But Jill Graham would be working with a joint committee that would work on the package, and she would have the current recommended figures for the Southern New England Conference. And the other reality is housing. Montana housing was much less expensive than Massachusetts housing. And you call someone, they may want to buy a house and have a large mortgage, and they're going to want to negotiate in terms of their needs based on that. But rental housing is much higher here than in other parts of the country. So all of that is a part of that package.
I was just looking for a ballpark figure. Thank you very much.
Rita, I can also add to that the package that we offered to Julie when she came, when she was full-time, the entire package was $90,000.
Thank you very much.
And I would add to that just the one thing, you would probably end up going a little higher than that, both to be competitive among the members of a pool of applicants to really get the person you want, and also because often what is offered to an interim is a little bit different than a full-time pastor long-term. So my naming of 100,000 maybe was kind of on target. That was just a rough guess for me there.
Well, and a last comment too about that is that if we're talking about sharing a pastor, we're not talking about coming up with, we're talking about coming up with half of the money if we share the pastor 50-50,
Right.
which feels a whole bunch better in our congregation right now than trying to come up with money for 3/4 or full-time.
And one other thing I meant to say as I was talking about all the benefits is it's important to remember that split that Janet had just named, recognizing that if you were to use the 90 figure you started with Julie, and you've changed that out of your own needs, just imagine if you drop down to 50,000 to have comfortable full-time ministry, that overage, 40,000 say, is now available for the costs of maintaining your building, available for new kinds of mission. It opens up a lot of possibilities. That's the win-win of shared ministry.
Janet,
Yes.
can you hear me? This is
Yes.
Steve.
Great,
Okay.
Steve. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question that Cindy said I could simply speak rather than type it out, so I will speak it. Randy,
Steve.
hi, Randy. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome.
Given that the driving force for each church considering sharing are the related factors of declining membership and declining finances, what are the prospects for the shared minister to help both churches possibly restore their capacity in the future for separate and full-time ministers? And what is your experience in that regard? Is that a possibility? Because I would, speaking just for myself, I would love to have this church be back someday where it could afford a full-time minister of its own, and probably the folks in Southwick feel the same. So would you comment on that?
Yes. One of the realities that all of us in the church world face right now is that with COVID, we're really hampered in ways we had never anticipated before. And that has to have an impact on church growth too. But a couple things that occurred to me, it's hard to look for a bright side of COVID, but I would say that in terms of the use of technology, Zoom and other related things, and just putting together worship in a new way enhances the ability of churches going forward. I think you might be excited to think about how now you're bringing live worship into the lives of your shut-ins, or people who may be home not feeling well but still want to be connected to the church. I've heard some churches saying they're getting support from all over the country now. And I have a personal friend here, a rabbi, who I do a lot of projects with now here at Loomis Village. He and I like to pretend we're carpenters now. And he and his wife have been sending money to a large synagogue in New York City because they really love what that synagogue is about. At the same time, she's a UCC member, and so this rabbi has now become a member of the UCC church in South Amherst, and they support that church as active members, but they also send money to the synagogue in New York because they value so much what it's doing. So part of what I'm answering Steve with is to say, who knows what the future might hold for you in terms of continuing to apply what you're learning right now with the use of new media, new skills, and putting worship together. I think once COVID is over and you really can be at the point of being a face-to-face live community again, if you're sharing ministry and you have more money to work with, I think both churches would be in a position to rebuild their ministry in a much more dramatic way than you can when you're struggling financially. To be comfortable financially as a church gives you new possibilities. So if that were to be the case, and I would wish that for you, that you could grow again and become independent, and a shared ministry can end whenever one or both partners say it's time to change the terms. So I think there's real potential for you guys in particular. And an example you're already living into is what Martha's just engineered, bringing the school into a connection with your building, your use of building. Our buildings can be a tool for us, and you find music ministries are tools for us. And if you create a live youth ministry and new missions, like relating to the school and education, all of that is a way to bring in new people to the church as well. When I was the pastor of the church in Cleveland for 10 years, in my 10 years, half the membership died and half were replaced by new members during my 10 years. So we didn't grow that much in one sense, but we kept growing enough to maintain. And this was with a church that drew people from 30 miles away. It was a big radius. We were kind of unique, 50-50 black and white. There aren't many churches like that in the whole country. So I was excited that we kept managing to draw new people. And I kind of assumed it was because we had a wonderful music program like you have. And that often was, I would ask new members always, so why did you come to us? How did you find us? And many of them would say, because of your music program. We hear things you're doing and that appeals to us. But others said, because of your mission, we had developed so much mission. We had all kinds of things going on, and that became known in the wider community. And people were joining us for that. And our youth group was doing such exciting things. I took youth out to do a powwow in Montana in 1976. We stayed on Chief Austin Two Moon's ranch, and his grandfather was part of the battle against Custer in 1876. So we joined them in 1976 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the defeat of Custer. That was their term for the gathering. We stayed with them at that ranch with about 3,000 Indians representing 10 different tribes. And they put a sign up on our camp, called us the Honky Camp, even though we had Black kids with us as well. So that's an example of the kind of ministry we were doing. And the word got out. Our kids were drawing new kids to the church because we were doing things like that all the time as well. So I say that to say that in sharing a ministry, the strength you will have because you have added resources can lead you to do new ministries on top of what you've always done before. And those new things, as well as what you've done, draw new people. You can grow and maybe become independent again if you choose. It's a long answer, but I hope that helps give you a sense of the possibilities.
Absolutely. And with that, I want to thank you, Randy, for your insight. And I think unless there's a pressing question that we haven't gotten to, that I'm going to ask you to close in prayer. And let me say one more time, thank you to everyone who has stayed in the sanctuary and who has joined us in Zoom. Martha.
Just a reminder, if you have other questions on the letter, we're all the contact information for the search committee people. So I really urge you, if you have questions, contact us and we'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. And
And
now, Randy, yes.
Well, I would add, if questions arise yet that you need some input from me, feel free to be in touch still. But you will also be able to, and you will be turning to Jill Graham from the conference for mutual support and answers. So whatever works, I'll be helpful as I can. And I would also recommend that you look at how Southwick designed their voting process to make their final decision. Terry Putnam, the moderator, created a really good model for safe election that people could feel good about. And the participation was phenomenal. I thought the number of people who responded, and they came up with that positive vote, which I was pleased to see. So with that, pardon?
Thank you.
Okay, well, let us pray. O God of possibilities and new things, we turn to you in closing to thank you for this faith community, for the Westfield Church, for its long, rich history, for the many ways it has served the town and the wider community. We pray that you be with the members as they discern what their future should be. Fill them with the love and spirit that we know through your Son, Jesus the Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Goodbye, everybody. Good to see you all. I wish you all the best.